Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We've got a great crowd this morning. Last week we had 86 or 89, I don't remember which. And I think we're going to beat that this week. Welcome to the GVR Forum Club. We meet every Wednesday and have presentations, and I see some new faces in here, and we picked up a lot of new members. The membership is really, really expensive for a club. It costs you $2 per year. Oh my God, I heard somebody say, yeah, $2 a year. And we will have presentations. I believe that we are going to stop presentations the middle of April this year. Some of my helpers have already left, some of them will be leaving, and we will be leaving the end of April, so we will start up again in October, just so you know. Today, and I'm not going to, I'll tell you about it in a minute. I don't have. Chris, okay, it's back. I normally tell an Ole and Lena joke about this time of the thing. I don't have one prepared today. That's what they give me every time. Our presenters today are faculty members of mine, co-faculty members from Minnesota, and they have come down here. They are both now retired, and they're down here living in Tucson, both of you, I believe. And they have this wonderful show that they're going to do for you today. Wayne Goodmanson is the photographer of the two, and he and I have known each other since we were students in the 70s, perhaps. The historian is Peter Berninger, and I actually took a class from him when I was just after I returned from the airport. And he told me a little story this morning about getting out of class one day, and he saw me hop on a motorcycle, zoom down the street, and he said, boy, I don't think that guy's going to amount to anything. Well, I'm now MC of the Farm Club, so I don't know if I amounted to anything or not. But anyhow, today we're going to have Wayne and Peter talk to us about what is this, what place is this? And you guys are on.
Thank you, Les. It's great to be here, and what a wonderful turnout. It's a delight to see people show up. Just a brief announcement here. The exhibit called What Place Is This is going to be at the Tubac Center for the Arts. And and the opening reception is April 8th, it's a Friday, 5 to 7 p.m. So stop by, but it will be up for the whole month. After which we've donated the exhibit to the Pima Community College, and they're going to circulate it to four of their campuses, and at some point it will be at the airport. They have a gallery there. So you can see it, let's see, you can see it more. And in addition to the exhibit, there's an exhibition catalog which has all of the sites. And I have a few here. If you're interested in them, you're welcome to buy them. They'll also be available at the Tubac Center for the Arts. So you can pick them up. And the exhibit is something that Dieter and I are going to talk about today, but we're not going to show you the whole thing. But instead, since I'm a photographer and Dieter is a historian, we'll comment about, I think we have about 7 slides. We'll show you from the perspective of a photographer and from the perspective of a historian. Oops.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's fine. That's fine, thanks. My wife and I live on a Indian reservation in northern Minnesota, within the original boundaries of the reservation. And I started my first documentary project there in the 1973, when I was going to document the White Earth Indian Reservation. And I failed miserably, and I just sort of overwhelmed with the complexity of the place. There wasn't one thought or one position on anything, and I was completely ill-prepared. Well, I finished that project about 4 years ago. So tells you I'm a slow photographer. And this is the book. It's called White Earth Window, and you can look through this. And the idea sort of came from Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, who always said, who are the people in your neighborhood? And that's what I set out to do. And so it ended up being, in some ways, a sister exhibit to the one that we're going to talk about today, in that it deals with history and deals with my photographs of a particular place in an effort to understand the Ojibwe experience. So when I came down here, I was invited by Dieter some 8-10 years ago to have lunch. I asked him early on, well, what should I read? What should I know about Southwest Arizona? And he said, I'll pull together some books for you. And I didn't hear from him for some time. And I later came to realize that he'd taken my question very seriously, and he reread a number, and he gave me 5 books that I should consider, one of which was called Shadows at Dawn by Jacoby. That got us talking about these places. That book dealt with the Camp Grant massacre, where some 144 Apaches, exclusively women, children, and old people, were slaughtered one morning. And so we started thinking about, first we called it conflicted landscapes, but then Dieter suggested a different name, which comes from a poem by, I'm going to read it to you, by Carl Sandburg called The Grass. And that poem became kind of the guiding directional light for us as to how we pursued these other sites. Because we wanted to know, are there other sites around here where some violence has occurred between the 4 main people groups, the Apaches, the Tohono O'odham, the Mexicans, and the Americans. And they all were a participant in some of this violence against the other groups. So no one owned violence, if you will. But just in background, Carl Sandburg wrote this as a 40-year-old in 1918, just following the Great War. And there's a number of names that are mentioned, many of which you know, but let me just run by them again. Austerlitz was a decisive win for Napoleon, where 37,300 men died. Waterloo, a decisive loss for Napoleon, netted 65,000 men dead. And in those 2 battles, there were tens of thousands of horses who obviously were killed as well. So it was incredibly brutal. He mentioned Gettysburg, which is a turning point, as you know, in our Civil War, 51,000 dead. The battles of Ypres, and there were 5 of them over 4 years, more than 1 million people died. The Battle of Verdun, also World War I battle, lasted from the 21st of February until December 18th. That's 10 months. It was the longest, bloodiest single engagement where 3/4 civilian were dead. So those are the names, and I'm just going to read that poem, which became very important for us, called Grass. Pile the bodies high in Austerlitz and Waterloo. Shovel them under and let me work. I am the grass, I cover all. And pile them high in Gettysburg, and pile them high at Ypres and Verdun. Shovel them under and let me work. 2 years, 10 years, and passengers asked the conductor, what place is this? Where are we now? I am the grass, let me work. So it has to do with in some ways the horrors of war, but I think more to do with our sense of places and what has happened there. And in many ways, perhaps why that ground might be sacred. So Dean and I began this, and some 5 years later, we finished it. We're slow workers. And we ended up with 21 sites that pair my photographic Dieter's writing that occurred within about a 60-mile radius of Tucson and took place between 1680 and about 1880. So we had 21 of those, and there are many more. We chose those because of the mixture of who were the participants and geography. And so, but I'm not going to give you a photographer's background on this undertaking. And I want to talking about photography. This is a curious thing. Just a show of hands, is anyone in the photography club here? A few people? Okay. So I won't get into talking about pixels or development process. It'll drive you to tears right over there. But it's confusing to talk about photography because we confuse it with real life. One of my early photography jokes, I guess, was the guy who pulls out a photograph of their granddaughter and says, "Here's my granddaughter." And the guy opposite him says, "She's really small, isn't she?" The point being that there's a difference between the photograph of something and the thing itself. So talking about photographs is very confusing because we have that mixture. We could talk about the subject, which would be my granddaughter, or the gates of the college where we taught. And we could talk about, where am I? So that's what the photograph is of. It's of the main gates of my granddaughter. We could talk about the technical aspects of it. What's a good print? You could have done this, you could have done that, more light, more shadow. Those are technical issues involved. We could talk about the experience of having shot it. You know, I had a great time taking this picture, and after I took it, I tripped over a log and I sprained my ankle. What a miserable day, or I had a wonderful time. Well, that's the experience separate from the subject, separate from the technical. We can talk about composition, and there I offer for your photographers out there, there's only one rule in photography about composition, and that is there's no rule in photography about composition. And then lastly, we can talk about the meaning of the photograph or the image, and that is what is the photograph about? And back to my main gate discussion. We all can go out there and take a photograph of the main gate of Morehead State University. It would all be the main gate, but it could be the meaning, what the photograph evokes could be totally different. One could be nostalgia, one could be it's compositionally driven, one could be sarcastic or some ironic thing, one could be humorous. It all depends what you bring from it. It's like an actor going to the stage. It's not that you found the stage, it's what you do once you got it. So that's the issue. And to complicate things, what happens when you put photographs together? You can have a collection of photographs, like you'd have a collection of stamps. Everything in your stamp collection is a stamp. So you could collect certain kinds of things. You could have a narrative, which in some ways is kind of what we did as we start chronologically to move forward in time. Or you could have a sequence, which could have other sort of connectors within it. So again, another consideration for thinking about photography. And then we get into a whole other field, which is the histories, if you will, of the photographs. This project of mine and Dieter's falls in the latter part of my photo career. So it could be my personal history, where does this fall in that line? Or it could be, where does it fall in the medium of photography? This photograph is compared to others who did similar things. Or where does it fall into the art arena or into the cultural arena? So all these, but we leave that to the critics. But the point is, talking about photographs, you have to keep in mind it's very singular kind of thinking within that. So enough of that blather. Let me see if I can done this right. There we go. This is one of the sites, Canada del Oro, where a battle took place as the Apaches attacked the mule train heading from Tucson up to Camp Grant. And we finished our project, we had the catalogs printed, and Dieter and I were walking into the Presidio Museum in Tubac, and the curator there said, well, you got almost all of them right, but you got the wrong spot for this one. It was so down. So back to the drawing board, and this is very close to the Biosphere 2 entrance where this occurred. So some of this has to do with just finding these places. Some are known, some we had to dig up. Dieter's going to talk more about the business of historical research and developing those ideas. Dieter, did you want to add anything at this point? No. Okay. He's a direct man. This is Camp Grant where the bloody massacre occurred. And this kind of involved taking a different kind of photograph. Rather than a broad, serene landscape, I wanted something more ephemeral and more moody, because it was a gruesome undertaking. Primarily it was Tohono O'odham. And curiously enough, let me just back up a second. The previous photograph, it was the Apaches attacking the mule train. And the reason they were attacking it was primarily to get the mules, which were edible because their hunting grounds and their farming efforts were intentionally messed with, so they were starving. And following that, the United States changed their policy a bit in order to, quote, civilize these people. They encouraged them to move closer to this, to Camp Grant, which is an influence of the Tarahumara and the San Pedro River. And so they gave them food, just lived with the protection of the military there, and they then wouldn't be harassing the people of Tucson. So several of the organizers, a couple Americans, a couple Mexicans, rounded up the Tohono O'odham, and they walked through the night, and in the morning, sunrise, they bludgeoned these people with their clubs, and the few Mexicans and few Americans stood on the ridge and shot those who got away. They took some 27 prisoners, women and children, but all the rest of them butchered, scalped, etc. So I wanted this kind of picture to sort of be a little more evocative of that gruesome event. Incidentally, do you know Hughes? What's the name of that neighborhood in Tucson? Sam Hughes, thank you. Sam was one of the organizers of this massacre and funders. And the few people were brought to trial in Tucson, and the jury convened for probably all of 15, 20 minutes. They all got off. So, okay, Peter, you're on.
All right, come on.
Russ's tip about holding the microphone against your chin is great.
Beat it on my chin. Okay. You see me slipping, raise your hand. All right, well, good morning, and it's good to see such a large group of people here. I have a couple of disclaimers or things to point out to get us started here. My little story, which I've told in other venues, about having to deliver something on someone's home and pressing the doorbell and waiting for them to open up and looking down at my feet and seeing I was standing on a mat that said, "On this spot in 1868, absolutely nothing happened." So I've always been, as a historian, I've always been interested in the denial of history. We tend to assume that if a landscape is empty, maybe nothing happened there or nothing of importance happened there. So in a sense, our project is an attempt to bring back to life things that are forgotten and perhaps enrich people's experience when they drive or walk through there to realize that this is not exactly empty space historically by any means. The other thing is we live in a time where we are re-examining our group relations in American history, and the word Apache comes up over and over and over again in our project, and that bothered me for a while. I said, my gosh, what are we going to do? We look like we're Apache bashers, if there is such a thing. I'm sure there is. But that's a fact, you know. This was contested land between various bands of Apaches, Western Apaches, and people who came in onto their land. And it wasn't the Tohono O'odham who were primarily antagonists with the Mexicans, the Spanish, and the Anglo-American settlers. It was often the Apaches, partly because of their nomadic lifestyles and so on. So there is some sensitivity to that, perhaps, if you wanted to be there. Well, let's look at this particular slide. This is Mescal Spring. I'm going to talk about three of the ones that were of particular, well, I guess I would say I have a certain affection for them because they were tough to find out where this place really was. I came across a reference in a historian's work, general work, and he said, and in 1848, a number of citizens of Tucson were murdered when they left Tucson looking for some food because Tucson was starving at that time. They were completely surrounded by hostile peoples, particularly the Apaches again, but not exclusively so, and they were running out of food. The solution was for folks to leave Tucson, and 16 of them did. They headed about 60 miles to the southeast, maybe 25, 30 miles north of Fort Huachuca, and there were a lot of feral cattle there that had been abandoned when the Spanish Mexican settlers left the area because of the Apache threat. So they knew if they went there, they were likely to find cattle on the hoof, which they would then butcher there, pack up, and then ride back quickly to Tucson. That was the plan. And so finding exactly where Mescal Spring was very difficult. We had to consult a lot of maps. We had to look for other sources. Finally, we more or less decided Mescal Spring was in the spot you see here or very close to it. Nearly all of our photographs are, truth be told, approximations. They are not the exact spot because no one knows where the exact spot. When somebody fell off their horse with an arrow in them, they didn't put down a little red flag and say, this is where I fell. You historians in the future, make no doubt about it. So we trekked up here, noticed the spring, noticed that there was some cattle business up in this area, and put two and two together, and then cross-checking a couple of other sources said, this is the Mescal Spring we're looking for. This one, Babo Kivari, is not too far from here. I think maybe if you get on a high enough hill, you'll see it. It's a very prominent mountain on the eastern end of the Tohono O'odham reservation, and it is a sacred spot for the Tohono O'odham. It's where their creation myth is located. Their creator, God Itoi, created humans here and set them on Earth. So there's a certain irony that in the early 1840s, the Tohono O'odham were defending themselves, their culture, their land, against a Mexican army detachment that came up from Sonora. The governor of Sonora, Manuel Gondara, was trying to pacify this area so that mining and other economic pursuits could take place for people who are moving up from Mexico into this area. Now, this is 1841, 1842, 1843, before the United States took over the area. It was also an area that was not very well administered by Mexico at that time. And so the Tohono O'odham were emboldened to protect themselves against what they saw was a weaker Mexican force. They ended up on the flanks of this mountain, Baba Kivari, trying to protect themselves against the oncoming Mexicans. It was a major battle, you might say, in the sense of the kinds of conflicts that we have here in the Southwest. And it cost approximately 40 Tohono O'odham lives, and they were eventually defeated in this spot, only to try again the next year and the next year, and so on, before eventually the reservation was established and they had some kind of security in the area itself. So when we went here, we went and located Mr. Steele, who works at the Tohono O'odham Cultural Center. He drove us out there, and he said, "We know the battle was here, but do you think we've ever found one item that corroborates our suspicion, like a bullet casing or anything like that?" Nothing at all. Again, historical locations are sometimes an approximation. It's not like archaeology, where you dig down and you eventually find something tangible and say, aha, here's that proof we want. There isn't any material culture left to establish what we were actually looking at.
Could you tell what the finding the documents?
Oh yes, very good. This was finding the documentary evidence for these things took many different pathways. Sometimes it's very easy. Say Wikipedia was a big help in a couple of cases. But in this case, there is a document in the ethnographic library here at the University of Arizona that is in Spanish, which is okay because I do read Spanish, and is being laboriously translated into English, and they would not, they were really reluctant to have me see it because they didn't want me to use a document that they had not yet put their seal of approval on. They're very proud of the work they do. They want it to be accurate. They didn't want anyone coming in there and sort of mucking around with a half-baked document. But it's a document that was written by the Sonoran governor's aide, you might say, and he kept a diary of the battle, and he's a primary source then of what actually happened there. And many people wondered where that document was. I was lucky enough to encounter where it was being kept and worked on, and they allowed me to get a few ideas off it, which were all we really needed to find this place. It never really said where the battle was, it just said it was. You may.
I just want to add that I come from a journalism background, and our mantra is always follow the money. In this case, Dean and I came to learn that here you follow the water. Civilizations survived because of the water. It was the washes that became the rivers where people traveled. So it was important. So in this photograph, You can see just to the left of that rock, this slight stream coming down. And the mountain, sort of, you see through the trees is where the dawn or the creation myth is occurred. And these were the rocks and the mountains that they hid behind when they're being blasted by the Mexican army.
You have to think about the sort of spiritual urgency that all of the defenders had in that year, where they're being backed up against the very mountain where their creation myth is situated. So it's kind of like the last battle in the Vatican or something like that, I suppose I'd say. Thanks. Okay, Madera Canyon. Who could resist this story? Because many of you have gone to Madera Canyon, you've been sitting there at the lodge, watching the birds gather there. And of course, it's a major mecca for bird watchers from all over the world, for that matter. And now imagine yourself sitting there in 1860, and you happen to glance behind. This, of course, would not happen. And there's a woman in terrible physical condition, very bedraggled, weak. She's crawling along in a southerly direction behind where you're seated. Well, that woman was, in 1860, Larsena Pennington. And this story, the story of Madera Canyon, at least as we're telling it, is the story of a woman, 22-year-old woman from Tennessee, recently arrived in this area, marries a lumber entrepreneur named Page, who was doing some lumber work in the Santa Ritas. He comes to this area. It says we have to spend the night here. Let's set up a tent, and up maybe half a mile or so to the south, there's a place called the Big Rock. If you ever go up there, there is a very big rock that sort of protrudes into the road. And not too far to the south of that is where Mr. Page set up a tent for himself, his young bride, Larsena Pennington, and an 11-year-old girl named Mercedes Quiros, who Larsena was tutoring, perhaps in English, we don't know what. Anyway, in the morning, the men went off, he and a helper went off, run some errands. They left the women there, and after they left, a band of penal Apaches came and abducted them. Now, abduction was a common method used by Apaches, particularly if they wanted something for the ransom, either one of their own captives or perhaps trade goods. We're not sure. Anyway, they took Larsena and Mercedes, and they moved in an easterly direction over to Santa Rita's, and somehow or other, Larsena escaped, but not before she was wounded multiple times by the Apache spears. It took her many days to find her way back to that original camp, and when she arrived back there, she was hardly recognized. She was in such bad shape. And the irony is that there were large search party was organized. In fact, surprised me that this story actually made the New York Times that day, because the New York Times seemed to delight in stories of how awful it was out west. And so the men were looking for her, and they passed within probably 20 feet of her. She was lying behind the snowbank. This was in spring, and she failed to be able to communicate with them. She was so weak, and yet she survived. Now, this woman later on remarried because her husband, too, was killed by Apaches, and she became part of the family that established a historical society in Tucson, and Pennington Street or Avenue, whichever it is, in Tucson is named after her, the Penningtons of Tennessee, who came to Tucson. And that's what happened to them. So it's a very appealing story because it's a story of survival, and because it takes place somewhere located where a lot of tourists are going to be. And I'm thinking, what place is this? And I'm thinking how many of them might have their lives enriched or depressed thinking about Larcena Pennington while they were watching the birds at Madera Canyon. Which also reminds me, one of my regrets in this project is that I never found anything that happened right here in Green Valley. I really thought, oh, because we found places in Tucson, that was, and Tubac, but Green Valley, well, what was Green Valley in 1860, 1870? You tell me, I don't know, but perhaps the placemat in front of the door was right, nothing happened here, but I doubt that, because something always happens somewhere. Right.
It's always a joy to prove Dieter wrong. This site, and I'll have Dieter tell you the historical events that occurred, but a lot of our work had to do with finding these locations. And there was a murder that occurred just across past, I don't know what hole that is, 8th or 9th green there. You can just see the river where the river would flow. Just over there was a hotel, Canal Hotel. Is it Tarbox? Is that the person who was murdered? And some of the other people got away. But in finding this site, we were given directions. Someone said, oh, it's south of where we were talking to this person. He said, I've seen the buildings, that's where it's at. And we went back there, Dieter found the sources that referred to 10 miles north of a certain location. And in this book, we had the help of several cartographers, and they told me about a program which is now free called Google Earth Pro. And you could put a pin down indicating a starting point, and then you can find out how many inches, meters, feet, miles something is. And further, since I mentioned before that the rivers or the washes were kind of the early roadways, so we followed the Santa Cruz and just put little pins on there to kind of indicate the way the river moved. And when we got to 10 miles, it was exactly at that point there. So the idea of what place is this, what place, the golf course, or was the golfer, and sometimes you had serenity, sometimes you had sheer rage at how you were playing, but nonetheless, it was right there. And do you want to, Phil, you want to add more to this story of that event?
You mean the
Starbucks?
yeah, but I have a question for you. You said you were going to correct me. What's the correction?
The location of this?
Yeah.
You said nothing happens in Green Valley?
Is that Green Valley?
Southeast edge, kind of. So it goes. But anyway, that's also the Amazon Trail, another important historical event, was right there as well. So when you start to dig deeper, you realize that a lot of things have happened here. The other just little quick footnotes, because I'm mindful of what Wes had told me about. We start at 9 and we end at 10. I was giving a talk at a Rotary Club in Moorhead, a lunch. A friend asked me to do a little spiel. And so we had a very nice little meal. I turned to the master of ceremonies to my right. I said, how long should I talk? And he said, as long as you want, but we're leaving at 1. So anyway, Leslie, we are watching the clock.
What golf course is that?
Pardon me?
What golf course is that?
You know, I don't know off the top of my head. I could find it on a
I
map.
think it's good.
Does some of you know?
You do too? Towards Blackus.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So next time you're out golfing, you can say, I know what place this is. Dean, I'd like you to talk about the, if you would, the events that took place at Presidio. If you would be so kind.
Well, let's remember that Presidio means a fortified place. It's actually a fortress city. And that is a very common method used by the Spanish throughout the long colonial period from 1500 to 1800. It was the safest way to organize a town. So when Tucson was founded in 1775, long before anyone ever thought of Green Valley, by the way, or its golf course, I was momentarily stunned by this man. I'll fight back a little bit. Okay, the Tucson Presidio, you've all been to Tucson, you know that downtown, there are remnants of this fortified area. You can tour the inside of it. And it was begun in 1775, and it took a long time to get the Presidio to the point where it would really protect the community. So it was vulnerable to raiding by outsiders, and it withstood most of those attacks pretty well because they had managed to put up a couple of ramparts and fortified towers in the corners so that they could direct their fire towards the raiders, but in some cases the raiders almost reached the walls. So Tucson was a lovely target, and it was the mainstay of protecting that very young community from 1875 to 1884 is when most of these attacks took place. So about 3 or 4 waves of them. And if you reconstruct where the Presidio was, you can just about pinpoint where the major conflicts were between groups.
And what you're looking at here is the main gate just on the right of this building. That was the gate to the west. And it's there. Other parts you can see as well. So I want to thank you. I'm sure Dieter joins me in turning out this presentation. I hope you can see the full show at the $2 Center for the Arts. It opens Friday, April, let's say 6th? 8th, thank you, Friday the 8th, 7 to 9, and then it will be up that whole time. And you can see, we try to give you some of the backstory, some of our thinking about the research, making these decisions, and traveling about. But it really was a joy. As they always say, it's not getting to the top of the hill, but it's the way up. The process was a lot of fun. We learned a lot about